Again, I'm Peter Larson. This is a session on the ongoing Palestinian struggle to remain in Jerusalem, the city where they've lived in for hundreds of years. My two guests today are Dr. Munir Nuseibah and Lily Feidy, who is the Dean of the Husseini College for Women in Quds University, also in Jerusalem. This is one of a series of lectures organized by the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. Since COVID 2 years ago, we've been doing one a month. They're aimed at helping people who don't know very much about the situation to learn a bit about it, and for people who are already activists to deepen their knowledge of the Israel-Palestine situation. Today, there's this welcoming note by me. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes giving some background on the whole issue of Jerusalem. Then we'll have Paula Deek and I will interview Munir and Lily for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, or whatever. We have some questions that we want to ask them on your behalf. And then we'll open it to questions and answers from the audience. And again, I remind you, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll end at 2:45. Now, some of this information and background, I'm sure, is already well known to most people on the call, on the Zoom call today, but perhaps not everybody. So I'll just give a very brief recapitulation. What you see in front of you here is a map, of course, with Israel in the beige color and the West Bank in the light color, and the Gaza Strip down in the bottom left-hand corner. Now, of course, you know that for Israelis, they call the whole thing Israel, and Palestinians call the whole thing Palestine. We're not going to get into that part of the discussion today, but in the middle of it is the city of Jerusalem, which has approximately 1 million population. Right now, about 2/3 of them are Jewish, another 30% are Muslim, and still about 5% are Christian. Now,
Peter?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
A couple of people in the chat are saying that they can't see the map.
They can't see the map.
Yeah.
All right. Can you see it?
No, I cannot.
All right. So hold on for a second. I'm glad that they've done this. Let's see what's the trouble here. I know why. Does that work better? Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Apologies. Thank you for flagging it.
Yeah, we see it, but it's not in presentation mode.
All right. Now I'll put it in presentation mode. How about that?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. Oh dear, that's what happens for. Anyway, I'm glad we have competent people on the line. So I was just going to show the map there, this map here, where I pointed out Israel, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, the whole area, what the Israelis call Israel, what the Palestinians call historic Palestine. It's bordered by Egypt down here, by Jordan, the kind of orangey color there, Syria up the green on the right, and to the north is Lebanon, and in the middle of it is Jerusalem. The status of Jerusalem needs to be understood in the context of the UN decision in 1947 to give 55% of historic Palestine over to European Jewish refugees to allow them to create a Jewish state. And what the proposal was that there be a Jewish state and an Arab state, but actually it was to divide the area into three, because the third area was to be Jerusalem. And the proposal was that Jerusalem would be internationalized. And you can see on the map there, that orange button there. Of course, the Palestinians didn't approve of giving up half of their country to European refugees. The Israeli organization, or what became the Israeli organization, Ben Gurion, officially accepted the plan, but that many of the Jewish militia groups actually wanted much more land, including control over Jerusalem. They didn't accept the UN idea of making Jerusalem independent. And they ended up taking over part of Jerusalem and expelling the Palestinians from there. So in the second map here, the purple is the area that was taken over by Zionist militias over and above what the UN had decided on in November 1947. Now, Jerusalem, of course, is a very important city. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. It's at least 5,000 years old. It's been home to different faiths for a very long time. Judaism, as we know, arose somewhere in the area around 3,000 years ago. Many people in the area then converted to Christianity at the time of Jesus, and later than that under the Byzantine Empire. And many of them converted again to Islam when the Caliphate came about 650 AD, something like that. And since that time, for the last 1,400 years, people of all three faiths have both lived in Jerusalem and found Jerusalem a very important place for their religion. Now here you have those two maps that you saw before, and on the right, I've expanded the map of Jerusalem. As I said, if you follow this orange line on the outside, this is what the UN said, that all of that area would be under international control, so that all three faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, could continue to enjoy Jerusalem. That did not, the Zionists did not accept it, and they took over all the part that you see in beige here. And so then from that point on, this became part of Israel, and the Palestinians, the non-Jews, the Christians and the Muslims were expelled. They were forced out of that area forcibly, and they moved over into East Jerusalem. That was done partly by pressuring people, partly by massacres. There was a famous massacre at Deir Yassin, which took place where 120 villagers were killed, and the Zionists made a lot of noise about that, which scared many other people to flee for their lives over into East Jerusalem. And then this line here became the effective dividing line between Israel over here. The green line became the effective dividing line, and this became at first under Jordan, which was trying to protect part of historic Palestine. After 1967, Israel captured all of the West Bank, and then they started expanding Jerusalem even farther. So from taking this part here in 1948, they expanded the municipal boundaries to this one, covering much more area, and of course, including many more Palestinians. This was deemed illegal by the UN, but Israel started to undertake this program of Judaizing. That is to say, once again, expelling more Palestinians from this area and turning it into more Jewish area. The wall was a further continuation of this. When the wall, you see this red mark here is where the wall goes. So now the wall becomes de facto the kind of border, and it becomes more of a land grab, and it also excludes Palestinians living outside from accessing hospitals and schools and cultural activities in East Jerusalem. This term, Judaization, that I'm using is not my term. It's an official term. It's actually an official policy of the State of Israel. And if you go on Wikipedia, you can read about Judaization. But basically, it has two aspects to it. One part of Judaization is to encourage Jews to move into Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem. Economic incentives, highways, public infrastructure, and so on, and helping the insertion of settlers into Palestinian neighborhoods. But it also has a second aspect, which is to try to encourage or force non-Jews to move out of Jerusalem, making it harder to live there, undercutting their businesses, restricting access to the holy sites, and so on and so forth. In fact, just today, I picked up in The Guardian that there's been another demolition exercise going on in Sheikh Jarrah. Now, I didn't want to focus exclusively on Sheikh Jarrah, though it's something that is very well known. I want to talk about some of the other aspects, but I just want to show a little video, 3-minute video on some dynamic of what is going on in Sheikh Jarrah now. And I can do that by doing the share screen.
Afraid to say
You got that now?
colonialism anymore. People are not afraid to
Yes.
call it as it is.
Okay.
And
Yes,
I
perfect.
truly also believe that the brutality of the Israeli army, the brutality of the police has shown the true face of Israel. The case of Sheikh Jarrah is one that is very important. It is a neighborhood where the remaining few Palestinian families are surrounded by Israeli settlers, and they are being forcibly evicted from their homes at gunpoint. So the Israeli court is really just paving the way for settlers to take over these homes. These Palestinian families are being driven out. What is happening in Sheikh Jarrah should not be separated from what happened in 1948. And let us recall the argument that the Israeli government and pro-Israeli lobby often uses about 1948 and the mass displacement of Palestinians. Well, they just fled. They fled their homes. Sheikh Jarrah today shows us how they are driven out, how they are suffocated into leaving these homes, not by choice, but by imposition, by an imposition of a military army. The struggle in Sheikh Jarrah did not begin this week. It did not begin last week. It has been ongoing for years. For years, these settlers have been trying to kick Palestinians out of their homes. Hamad al-Kurd, who we have seen on social media, along with his sister, Muna al-Kurd, they recollect the struggle of their grandmother, Rifqa, who died at the age of 103, older than the state of Israel. And yet somehow these settlers tried to drive her out of her home that has been there for generations. This is a struggle that goes beyond Hamad al-Kurd, beyond his years. It is much older than him.
That was from B'Tselem, that little clip. But as I said, today, what I really want to do is not focus on Sheikh Jarrah, even though it is important. I want to focus on the other things that are going on, the other ways in which Judaization is carried out. I've seen a little bit of this myself. For example, there are constraints on Palestinian schools in East Jerusalem if they don't teach the Israeli curriculum, even though they're in what the international community calls East Jerusalem occupied territory. If they don't use the Israeli curriculum, the students can't graduate and get jobs. There is a Edward Said Conservatory of Music in East Jerusalem that is continually being harassed. In the Old City, there are policemen, Israeli policemen, continually. These measures don't really hit the headlines like the ones we just saw, but there's continual pressure that's being applied. And that's what I'd like to talk to Munir, Nuseibah, and Dean Lily Feidy about today. Munir was born in Jerusalem. His family actually traces itself back in Jerusalem for 1,300 years. He's a professor of law at Quds University. He's a director of the Community Action Center, and I'd like to have him talk a little about that today in the Old City. And he has a PhD from the American University in Washington. And our other guest today is Dean Lily Feidy, who is the Dean of the College for Women at Quds University in East Jerusalem. She has a PhD from the University of Delaware. She has formerly had a senior position in the Ministry of Higher Education in Palestine, and she's been very active in empowering Palestinian women and youth and in promoting good governance. So I'd like to ask Munir and Lily to join us, please, and Paula as well. And so we'll be able to have a little conversation with you. First of all, let me say, Lily and Munir, thank you very much for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it. And I want to introduce Paula Deek, who is a collaborator of mine. Paula is a Palestinian Canadian, a Canadian of Palestinian origin. Her mother comes from Haifa. And Paula and I are going to just quiz you guys on what you do and why you do it and what you see. So since I've talked quite a bit, I'll ask Paula to take the first go at it. Paula, over to you.
Hi, yes, welcome. Thank you guys very much for being with us, and also for all of our participants that are viewing. I guess we'll just start on top of what Peter Larson has already told us about you. Is there anything else you can tell us about yourselves and what it's like to be living in Jerusalem? So if it's okay that I say ladies first, we'll start with Lily.
Hi, everyone. It's really a great opportunity to talk to all of you. My name, as you've seen, is Lily Feidy. I'm a Jerusalemite, was born in Jerusalem, lived all my life in Jerusalem, except for the years that I was in the United States studying for my master's and PhD. My father was born in Jerusalem. I was 11 years old when the 1967 war took place. So I remember it very vividly. My father was a refugee became a refugee in 1948 with all his family, because my grandfather had all his business in the western part of Jerusalem, and he lost everything after 1948. He was 63 years old and could not take it, and he died from heart attack at Damascus Gate, watching the Israelis separating the East from the West. I've been a professor of applied linguistics at Birzeit University in the West Bank, where I did my undergraduate degree. I taught at Birzeit University for 15 years after my return from the States. And later on, I joined Dr. Hanan Ashrawi in the Palestinian Ministry of Higher Education, where I was the Director General for International and Cultural Affairs. And then I moved to an NGO, a Palestinian non-government organization called Miftah, which was also established by Dr. Ashrawi. And we acted as a catalyst to promote the role of women and youth in politically and economically and socially in Palestine. And then I moved 3 years ago to Al-Quds University, and I'm heading the all-female college, which is Hind al-Husseini College, which is actually being challenged by a lot of Israeli institutions that are competing with us on actually attracting students from East Jerusalem to study at their institutions by providing scholarships and by pouring a lot of money into the education sector.
Maybe we'll get it maybe a bit later. We'll get into some of the actual challenges that poses to you, how the Israelis impinge on the college. I think that would be terrific.
This is all for now. Perhaps we can talk. It's an important issue is that the college is situated in Sheikh Jarrah vicinity.
Right.
So we're across the road. And yesterday we've seen what happened with the family of Salhiya when the Israelis tried to raid the house because the pretext is that the land was owned by Jewish people. I say Jewish because Israel wasn't established yet prior to 1948. And today morning at dawn, they invaded the house again, arrested all the people, and destroyed the building. Their pretext again is that they want to erect a kindergarten for the people of Jerusalem, meaning the Palestinians of Jerusalem. And of course, Sheikh Jarrah is also inhabited by a few Israeli families. So under this pretext, they try, of course, and under security, between parentheses, they justify every act. Israeli courts are, of course, very biased in terms of what is right, what is wrong, but probably my colleague Munir would be able to address the legal issue more than I can.
Maybe that's a good opportunity to just hear a little bit more about, thank you, about Munir's involvement, particularly in, I know you're a professor of law, but you also run this community action center. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
Yes, so I have been interested in human rights. I would say at least since I studied law at Quds University, the same place where I'm working right now, between the years 2000 and 2004. And during this period, there were a number of incursions that the Israeli army conducted
A number
in
of
Palestinian
what?
cities.
A number of what?
Incursions. Incursions, invasion, yes.
Insurgents.
No, incursions, like to invade cities with the army. Raids, yes. And during that period, I volunteered in a number of places, including actually Community Action Center, the center that I'm heading right now. And during that period, I and with Amnesty International and Adala and other organizations who were actually working on documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity. I was just translating to lawyers and other personnel who were taking these affidavits from individuals who witnessed or were victims of a number of crimes. This certainly made me much more interested in human rights defense. So after I finished my undergrad, I studied in the US. I did my master's LLM in the US, and later on I went to the UK to do my PhD. Also, I co-founded a unit in the Faculty of Law called the Human Rights Clinic, which actually trains students on human rights advocacy skills during their undergrad studies. So they document violations, they give legal services, and as you mentioned, I currently head the Community Action Center based in the Old City of Jerusalem. This center is designed to serve the Palestinian public in Jerusalem through legal aid, as well as international advocacy, as we have been doing for a number of years now. As I'm sure during this webinar, we will discuss a number of violations that take place on a continuous basis in Jerusalem, mainly for the Judaization of the city, but also for the continuation of some colonial domination over the Palestinian people in a number of forms. Therefore, this center, unfortunately, is unable to eventually prevent all of these actions. None of us is able to prevent human rights violations or to stop them. But in some cases, we are able to minimize the effect on individuals.
So,
I'm
Munir,
not
let me
sure
just,
if this is the... I can leave it for later. If
well, I
you
just
think
want to
that's
ask
more appropriate.
to concretize it. You know, we Canadians can imagine what a community action center is in the city of Ottawa, for example. There are people who are homeless, or people who have been badly treated by the city, or people who have, you know, various things have happened to them. But in your case, the Israelis aren't really very interested in what kinds of cases do you get, and how do you provide any kind of, how do you resist, basically?
Yes. So when you introduced Jerusalem, you mentioned Israel conquering West Jerusalem in 1948 and totally depopulating it from any Palestinians who existed and who were present in the western part of the city at that time. And then the occupation of 1967. But after the 1967 occupation, many Palestinians continued to live there. And we are either them or their descendants. As soon as Israel occupied East Jerusalem, it gave the population of East Jerusalem the civil status of permanent residents in Israel. This is due to the fact that Israel annexed East Jerusalem. This means that Israel decided to consider this part of the city as an integral part of Israel. Of course, this is illegal in international law, and occupying power is not allowed to annex occupied territory. Nonetheless, Israel took this measure and insists until today that this is the way it should be, and this is the way it should continue. But however, while it annexed the city, it did not really annex the people. It gave the people only residency status. And of course, not all the people who were residents of Jerusalem, those who happened to be abroad for any reason or who were displaced during the war, and many who left after the war were not granted this status and became total foreigners to the city. But those who managed to continue to live in the city were considered residents.
So
this
help a Canadian understand that, because
yes,
I mean, I'm a resident of Ottawa. I don't. It's not a legal status. What does it mean?
Yeah. Yes. There is a difference between citizenship and residence. A citizen is a person who has full rights in a country. They have political rights. They can vote in political elections, and it is almost impossible to kick them out of their country. Residency is a different type of situation. You are considered to be a foreigner. So if somebody just lives in the in Canada, but who is not a Canadian, maybe they get different types of visas. The best one of them is a permanent resident, a person who can live and who can work. And this is the type of status that we Jerusalemites have. We can live, we can work, we pay taxes, we are members in the social welfare system, so we pay the taxes also to the social welfare system, and we are entitled to medical treatment and all of that. However, this status is quite fragile. It is easily revocable. And Israel, since 1967 until today, has been developing the methods according to which it could revoke the status. So your status can be revoked if you leave Jerusalem for 7 years, or you get a residency abroad or a citizenship abroad, and later on they developed it to include also if your center of life is outside Jerusalem, which includes all of the West Bank and Gaza. And later also they developed a new criterion called the breach of allegiance to the state of Israel. So if if the Minister of Interior is convinced that you have breached allegiance to the state by any involvement in terrorism or any involvement in treason, as they call it and as they consider it. And by the way, the term terrorism is very wide. Recently, Israel has declared 6 human rights and civil society organizations as terrorist organizations. So the term terrorism does not mean that you're actually throwing bombs at civilians or other things, So in any of these cases, you would be considered, your residency would be revoked. So many Palestinians are victims of residency revocation, but also it's very difficult.
When you say many, do you mean dozens? Do you mean hundreds? Do you mean thousands?
Thousands. Almost 15,000 Palestinians since 1967 have had their residencies revoked. But also, in addition to this, of course, if your residency is revoked, you cannot pass it to your children. But also, even if your residency is not revoked, it's very difficult to pass your residency to your children. Israel has constructed a very difficult bureaucratic regime according to which a Palestinian, especially if a Palestinian is married from Jerusalem, is married to another Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza, or a foreigner, or the child has been born abroad, it becomes quite a difficult procedure to actually pass this residency status to the children. Also, Israel has made it complicated over the years, certainly since 2000, more clearly, to invite your family members who do not have a residency status to live with you and to get a permanent residency status in occupied Jerusalem. All of these issues, we call them the residency issues. Community Action Center provides services to the Palestinian public in these areas. Unfortunately, the services that we give do not function according to internationally recognized rights in international law. We are only able to provide services according to Israeli law, which is what Israel actually enforces. Therefore, instead of, for example, the right thing, if a Palestinian from Jerusalem is married to a Palestinian from Ramallah, this couple does not need a family unification application and process in order to live under the same room or the same house, under the same roof together. However, according to Israeli law, they need that. And the spouse who comes from Ramallah would never be able to get a permanent residency status at the end of the day, and they will be a permanent guest somehow in the city. So we fill this application for people and we help them to follow it up, only because this is the only way we can help people to survive under this regime and save thousands of dollars per case, thousands of dollars per case in lawyer fees, just to be able to live under the same roof. And in the same way, we help people just register their children to be able to live with them, to be able to, and we succeed in some cases, and that's important, but we also fail in others. We don't succeed in all the cases. There are many children who grow up in Jerusalem with no legal status at all. I'm not saying stateless, statusless. They have no status. They are not legal anywhere on this planet. And they grow up, and once you pass a certain age, you cannot get that status. And then you grow up, you have no ID card, you walk in the streets, you are stopped by police personnel, and you don't know what to do. So this is the type of situation that we are dealing with. And
thank you. Maybe we can come back to you. I'd like to understand better the pressures that Israel brings on you. You said that you have Israeli competitors. I mean, that was they would rather you just dry up and go away. I've been to your facility there in East Jerusalem. What kind of pressures do they bring on you, and how do you resist?
Okay, let me just add one other thing following what Munir had said about population of Jerusalemites. Actually, when Israel erected the apartheid wall, it claimed that the wall, the purpose of building the wall was to secure its population, Israeli population, from the terrorist Palestinians so that they do not cross to the Israeli side. Well, actually in Jerusalem, and if you've seen it when you visited, the wall cuts through the city of Jerusalem. What Israel tried to do by erecting the wall between Palestinians and Palestinians in East Jerusalem was to get rid of the areas where Palestinians are the only inhabitants in those areas, like in Dahiyat al-Barid, like in Bethany. And these are what they tried to do is divide the greater Jerusalem, which is actually the map that was recognized since 1964 when Jordan was ruling Jerusalem. So in East Jerusalem, you would see the wall dividing Palestinians from other Palestinians. So what they tried to do is just try to get rid of the areas that are fully populated by Jerusalemites, where they don't have settlers or any settlements. And again, a very important note, most of the people in these areas which live behind the wall, okay, we're in the wall, they're behind the wall, they consider them, by their definition, West Bankers. And again, they do not, of course, they do not consider them. I mean, you know, they have the ID, the blue ID that we have, which is like a green card in Canada or in the United States. Okay, but they don't enjoy any other privileges. Now, in Sheikh Jarrah, where I work, one important thing, okay, that Al-Quds University is facing. Al-Quds University has two campuses, one in what they call the West Bank, Abu Dis, which is actually a suburb of Jerusalem, but now it's divided by the wall, and the centers of the university in East Jerusalem, whether in Sheikh Jarrah, in Beit Hanina, another suburb near Jerusalem, and in the old city where Munir's center is. We did not get until now any accreditation from the Israeli Ministry of Education. So meaning that our students who live in East Jerusalem, in the old city and the suburbs of Jerusalem, carrying the Israeli or the blue ID, okay, when they graduate from our college, they cannot work at any institution in Jerusalem because of all the institutions and organizations in Jerusalem have to go or are under the Israeli law. So it's been a battle. It's a challenge for all of us. We're losing a lot of our students. I remember years ago, before I became dean to the college, that the college had at least 500 girls and women studying in it. Now we have the half of the students, because I can't blame them, but at the same time, I don't see I don't see an optimistic way out, because this battle has to be fought in the Israeli courts, and the Israeli courts are very biased. When I asked the lawyer, why is that so? He says, because Jerusalem to the Israelis, East and West, is unified capital of Israel, and we are considered as a foreign institution in our homeland. Okay, so now we're again in this battle of recognition and so forth. But can you imagine how much money is being spent to pay to lawyers and Israeli lawyers in order to get this recognition and accreditation?
Lily, how do you fight it? How can you fight it? What can you do?
Okay.
And are you working with anybody? Like, do you work with the UN or any other organization?
We've approached the presidency of the university and have approached a lot of organizations. Listen, let me clarify one thing. Under the term security, Israel can do anything. Nobody can stop Israel. Not the superpowers, not the US, not the UN. And we see this very clearly in all its action. The only thing that is available for us is to fight it in the Israeli courts. Now, and by also having an Israeli lawyer who knows the system and how to direct his defense. But actually, this is one thing, and the other thing is that in East Jerusalem, we have a mushrooming of educational institutions that are competing with us, okay? Which means that a student getting a degree, and of course they teach in Arabic, and the faculty members are Arabs, Palestinians. But the thing is that the quality of education in these institutions is not much better than ours. The thing is that when you graduate and you have your diploma, you can easily get to the system.
They recognize theirs. Yes.
They recognize the degree. Okay, because these institutions which carry either Israeli names or Palestinian names. Some of them are headed by Palestinians from 1948 and so on and so forth. But because they carry Israeli citizenship, a passport, unlike us, of course, they're granted the accreditation. The other thing that we always face is whenever we want to convene a conference at the college, and this has happened two times during my tenure. They come and the police comes and raids the college, saying that this is a political conference and that it is supported by the PLO, PNA, because all they see is Palestinians who are actually, you know, very well-known people as activists or as true Palestinians who want to come, and the conferences are actually academic conferences. Mm-hmm. That's all. One other thing is that we have, as a university also, to abide by the Israeli law in terms of, I'm not talking about the other taxes that we pay. We pay taxes as residents of Jerusalem, okay, as Palestinians who carry the blue ID. We pay the taxes, the same taxes that the Israelis pay, but we do not get the same services. Yeah. Our roads need pavement. Our schools, we don't have any new schools. Very few schools were built after 1967. Schools are crowded. The original public schools, or the UNRWA schools, or the Waqf schools, and we have private schools. But when I was a student and when my children were students, we had, and Munir also was a student at private university, we had almost 20 students per class. Now you have like 40, 50 in the public schools and sometimes 70.
And do you also pay additional taxes? Like you pay the same as taxes?
The same
but you pay additional?
No, well.
Nothing additional.
Yes. Now we have to abide by the Israeli law in Jerusalem as people who are working at a Palestinian university, at a college. And 2 years ago, they approached the university and asked for what they call the 101 form that has to be filled by every single Palestinian from East Jerusalem who's working at the centers of the Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, meaning that we pay the same amount of taxes that the Israelis pay when they're working at an Israeli institution. The problem is that we do not get the same salaries that the Israelis get, okay? We're way lower, okay? Because again, in Palestine, we have a unified salary system for all universities. So this burdens the university because it has to compensate for what we cannot pay. At the same time, it's telling us very clearly we know you're operating in East Jerusalem. We know that you might have West Bankers who are teaching in West Jerusalem, because if, you know, West Bankers can come from Ramallah or Hebron to teach with a permit, now they cannot, because they don't carry a Palestinian, they don't carry the blue ID, and they have other IDs, which are West Bank IDs. And so we were facing, I mean, 2 years ago up until now, we're facing shortage of professors, in at least in my college, where I have bachelor's degrees to offer. But 2 years ago, we were able to have some of the West Bankers who were good professors to travel from Ramallah, from Hebron, from Bethlehem, and now we cannot because of this form that is called 101, according to the Israelis. Other things that we're facing is the inability to be able to bring or to get, this is now not only for the college, but for the public schools, UNRWA schools, WACF schools, private schools, to get whatever we need from books, from resources, from equipment. Thanks God that we have IT and we have all the possibilities, technological possibilities that helps us, but still the schools are facing tremendous oppression from the Israelis, because Israel does not want the Palestinian schools in Jerusalem to use the Palestinian curriculum, which I criticize a lot, but at the same time, they don't want the students to know their history. So some pages in the books are just blank, because they talk either about a Palestinian hero, or what they consider a martyr, what we consider a martyr. To them, he's considered, or she is considered, a terrorist. And so it's their narrative against our narrative. But the worst thing that is happening now, well, it's been not now, I mean, it's been since the tenure of Netanyahu, is that the whole conflict is transformed from being political, colonialist, to being religious and ethnic. And what they're using, because the Israeli government is majority right-wing, and there is right and there is right of the right. Okay, like Bennett is right, is more right than Netanyahu. The thing is that according to what they think, that the Old Testament, the Torah gives them the right as a chosen people of God, okay, that this is their land, and it's either them or us. So it's been very racist, it's been very oppressive, it's been ethnic cleansing, and it's been, I mean, you know, again, if there were no television, if there were no media, social media, I think the situation would have been worse. But they, in Jerusalem, they want the city for themselves. And this is why Jerusalem is encircled by Israeli settlements. What they're trying to do is the demographic fight against us, okay? And this is the demographic fight.
We're just, we're getting near our time. I promised people the chance to ask questions.
Yeah, sure.
I have, first of all, I want to flag to people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You're free to use the chat box to talk to each other, but we will only be looking at questions in the Q&A. And I have one final question I wanted to ask to Munir before we open it up to the floor, and I'll get our secretary to look at some of the questions. Munir, do you have any business customers or Palestinian businessmen who bring problems to you. I happen to know of one man who had a shop and relied on trucks being able to deliver stuff to his shop, and Israel decided there would be a no parking zone, so the trucks can't stop there anymore. All kinds of little ways for harassing Palestinian businesses. Do you face any of that?
Yes, actually, we even started a couple of months ago to target merchants, specifically in the Old City, in order to give them services, mainly because of what we noticed in the Israeli occupation authorities targeting these merchants, especially in the Old City. The targeting usually happens in the following way. Either that one of these merchants has an argument with a policeman, and the policeman wants to teach this person a lesson, and then this policeman will call all the different law enforcement departments that are relevant to this merchant, and this merchant will end up with thousands or tens of thousands of shekels in fines. So I remember a person while we were basically just before we started this service, we were just discussing with merchants to see what they may need in terms of legal aid, and he told us this story where he had this type of argument, and then the policeman the following day came with it was a restaurant, so he came with the health services and inspection, with taxes, with all the other types of with like different fire safety and everything that you can imagine, and each one of them found something where they could find a mistake in the running of this restaurant, and they left keeping this guy with with dozens of thousands. I don't remember now the exact figure, but huge fines. This is one of the trends that we see. Another trend is when they feel that for example some violence happens in a certain area, and there were confrontations between the Israeli police and the Palestinian locals. They go down and they start also doing the same, going shop by shop, enforcing the regular laws, but making sure that they show the public that they are present. So many of the merchants, they are complaining about this, and they want help in these areas. Of course, this is also it's important to say that specifically in the Old City, the merchants are actually suffering, and they are unable to work properly. Tourism doesn't, despite the fact that Jerusalem is one of probably, if not the most, one, at least let me be humble and say one of the most important touristic attractions in the world, with holy places being present in the Old City, but all the tourists who come and go continuously in the Old City, especially when they come in organized groups, they don't get to shop in Palestinian shops. The Israeli tour guides, they lead them towards specific Israeli shops, and then only the individuals who are coming as individual tourists, they get to walk around and maybe shop here and there, and then these merchants can make some money. During the Corona period, especially during closures, the Old City was not accessible almost at all. While one of us could, go here and there to do shopping, the Old City was certainly off the, it was not an option. So, maybe I'm talking more about the Old City because that's where I am based, and that's where I see most of the violations, but also because I am aware that the old city of Jerusalem specifically is very much targeted. The Judaisation of Jerusalem took several forms and patterns since the occupation. At the beginning, they confiscated 1/3 of the total area of the annexed territory in Jerusalem, and they built huge settlements there. So at the beginning, they were Judaizing the surrounding of Jerusalem. At this stage, they are Judaizing what they call the heart, living in the hearts of the old city and the Palestinian neighborhoods. And that's why now we are witnessing, things like a house in Sheikh Jarrah, a number of houses in Sheikh Jarrah, a street in Silwan, a number of houses in the old city. This is the daily scene. There is this campaign of taking any house, but also making the lives of Palestinians who live and who work in the city very difficult, make it very desirable for them to live anywhere else. So that's part of the scene, and indeed the merchants are part of the population that is suffering from these policies.
Okay, thank you. So now our secretary has been watching our questions. Once again, I remind you, put your questions in the Q&A, please. And Yasmin, have you got some questions for our panelists?
Sure. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Dr. Nuseibah and Dr. Feidy. I'll start with a question from Doug, just because it's on topic with what you were just talking about, Dr. Nuseibah. He was asking what it's like to represent these merchants in Israeli courts.
Well, it is not easy to represent merchants, but also other Palestinian Jerusalemites in Israeli courts. I can give an example of a case that worked for us, and later on we learned that this person was targeted again. There was this baker who works in a bakery that existed since before the occupation actually came to Jerusalem. At some point, they actually used the same argument, Lily, that they are using for us at Quds University. They said, you don't have a permit to work as a baker, and you need to get the work permit from us. Well, this baker has been baking since I don't know when, but they use the same type of argument. You need to get a permit from us. And then they wanted to stop him from working. And then we intervened. And in that case, we managed to protect this person and protect his business. And he continued to work. So we were happy. We were like, that's a good success story. We don't always get success stories like that, but we were happy about it. Later on, we learned that they came with another case to the same baker. They said, you are using sausage and eggs also in your products, and you need a special permit to get sausage and eggs. So they also stopped him from working because of the type of material that he is using, that you are only allowed to bake bread, but not something that includes, although I remember that I've been eating sausage from this same guy since I was a child. I mean, I do remember that, but not that he has been doing anything new, but for some reason, they continue to target the same baker again and again. This is one situation. Another type of situation is also targeting Palestinians who have stands outside their shops to show some of their merchandise, and giving them fines as a result of having these small stands, despite the fact that these types of stands existed also for a very long time. So once in a while they come up with something, and then they what I could say generally about arguing in Israeli courts is that not only for merchants, but for any case regarding Palestinians, is that you only have a chance to win if you argue using a mistake in Israeli procedures. So the Israeli courts respect Israeli procedures. So if you can find a mistake that the Israeli authorities conducted in Israeli procedures themselves, then you actually have a good chance to win this case. But other than that, if you use principle while arguing your case, you have no chance. If you use international law, human rights, occupation, right and wrong, fair and any principle that is understandable for any sound person, that doesn't work. So that's something our lawyers know. They always look for procedural gaps. And in many cases, that's where we make most of our successes, but also because the Israelis exhaust the Palestinians in Jerusalem with so many problems that many will not defend themselves in the first place. So only those who manage to go to a lawyer who will actually take the effort to do that defense, that you actually have a chance to win.
Then will Israel go and correct those mistakes so that you can't use them again, or do they leave them?
No, they correct that specific case, but then we see that the same procedural mistake is still continuing, and that's something that I always see. Every day we get calls and visits from Palestinians, who are asked by clerks and employees in the occupation's bureaucratic system that have been answered several times in Israeli courts themselves. So it's not like these institutions will correct the procedure in order to make sure that they are happy to lose cases actually, but not to correct the procedures, even within the Israeli system situation. That's something I could say from my expertise, actually.
Interesting.
Yasmin, if you got another question to.
Yes, I do. So I'm going to pose this question to Dr. Feidy. Someone was asking what kind of assistance is provided to Palestinian residents of Jerusalem and their organizations by the Palestinian Authority, if any at all, and then the same for Palestinian representatives in the Israeli Knesset.
The Palestinian Authority is not providing enough assistance to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem for many reasons. One reason is that the Palestinian Authority is broke. They have no money. The Palestinian institutions, the public sector, where governments are supposed, the PNA here, I'm referring to Palestinian National Authority, which did much better. The Palestinian PLO did much better when it was in exile than it's doing here inside the country. One obstacle is that they don't have the money. We're very dependent on donor assistance, and this is one of the huge mistakes that I think it's been a trap for all of us, because most of the work of the public sector and the private sector is another story. Civil society organizations are totally dependent on international aid. So there isn't much that the Jerusalemites or Jerusalem institutions are actually getting from the Palestinian Authority. We're very critical of the abandonment of Palestinians in Jerusalem and their institutions. We've been very critical about this, but when we see the situation that is when we see the situation that is prevailing in the West Bank and also in Gaza, and how much unemployment we have, unemployment is on the rise, and particularly in the context of the youth and women. So there isn't much. I mean, there is some, but there isn't much. It's not enough for us to challenge the Israelis by establishing more institutions. Actually, a lot of the foreign representative offices in Jerusalem had moved to the West Bank. A lot of civil society institutions that were established in Jerusalem had to move to the West Bank because of the checkpoints, the apartheid wall, and so West Bankers cannot go back and forth. As for the Palestinian Knesset members, Palestinians of 1948, well, actually, I mean, some of them are excellent, while others, I cannot imagine a Palestinian from 1948 joining a Likud party or an Israeli Zionist party. I cannot imagine it. I cannot see how they can serve. But there are other political groups that serve in the Knesset, which are a coalition of democratic, progressive parties with an Islamic party that try. Okay, I'm not talking about the Islamic movement that is part of the Israeli government or the coalition of the Israeli government. I'm talking about the opposition. Opposition, which means Ayman Aoudeh, which means Ahmed al-Tibi, which means all the Palestinians that are in the opposition and who are progressive. They can't do much.
Could they in Canada, for example, if you had enough emphasis, you could get your cause raised in Parliament for discussion? Could
they do, but they're always, they shout and scream. I mean, you know, they try their best, but they're also oppressed like us. I mean, if anything happens in any Arab village, see what's happening now in the Negev, okay? It's basically Palestinian population, Bedouins that have been living there since the establishment of Israel. Now Israel wants to confiscate all the land because it wants green zones and so forth. So it's a systematic plan. It's a plan of demographic fight. When Sharon said that he wanted to withdraw from Gaza, he wasn't a man of peace. To him, he wanted to get rid of a part of occupied Palestine, which is heavily populated by Palestinians. So the demographic issue is very, very, very important for the Israelis, because they see that at the end of the day, and I'm here just reiterating what one Israeli from the Israeli Communist Party said. One day, the Palestinians demographically will be outnumbering the Israelis. So she said, and the Palestinians are deeply rooted here, okay? Because most of us were born here and lived here, and our parents also were born here and left here. While in Israel, the majority, okay, let me say not the majority, but they tried very hard, especially in the 1990s, to bring all the Russian Jews, which are basically 75% non-Jews, and that's why they changed they dropped in our ID the nationality, because there was a section in the ID where you're being identified by nationality, either Arab or Israeli. And so one lawyer told me early in the 90s that they dropped this part because the Jews who came, so-called Jews that came to Israel from Russia or ex-Soviet Union were actually mostly non-Jews. It was a stepping stone for them to come to Israel. Some of them stayed here, but it was a stepping stone for them to go either to Europe or to the United States, basically Australia and Canada.
I think we're going to have to move one more question,
Yeah.
and then we're going to have to move to winding up there. Yasmin, do you have another question to pose to our guests?
Sure. I'll give you an option of two, and you can decide, Peter, which. There's a lot of questions asking about what kind of pressure we can put on the Canadian and Western governments in general. And there's also another interesting question asking why or how is the Judaization of Jerusalem different than other areas like Hebron or Bethlehem?
Well, both sound like good questions. So maybe
I
one
think
can take one and one can take the other.
Canadians are always asking, what can we do? Or what can we stop doing?
Can I say it in just a nutshell, very briefly? The whole world can tell the Israelis, and for us, enough is enough. Our slogan is end occupation. And it's not difficult if the international community has the willpower to say to Israel, you have to comply with the resolution 242 and 338, which means 242 is 2 articles in the resolution. And this resolution, UN resolution, came out after the 1967 war, where it calls for the withdrawal of the occupying power from the Palestinian territories, West Bank and Gaza, and at the same time to establish 2 separate states. And this is what the whole world has on its table. The UN talks about 2-state solution. The superpowers talk about 2-state solution, but nobody tries to implement. Nobody has the political will. Now, we cannot live with the Israelis and with occupation because the United States or a foreign country is trying to help them facilitate our passage from checkpoints. What I would expect from any country, okay, Canada included, is to end occupation, call for the implementation of resolution 242 and 338. Why other resolutions that were put forward by the United Nations were implemented even with the help of NATO? Why is Israel above the law for everybody? Okay, so this is the only thing that we want: our human rights, we want our basic rights, we want our self-determination, and we want to live free of occupation.
Maybe I'll ask Munir to answer the other question, which was the similarity and differences between the Judaization of Jerusalem. Actually, Lily had mentioned what's going on in the Negev. Israel has a program of the Judaization of the Negev and also the Judaization of the Galilee as well. I've never heard it referred to as the Judaization of Hebron, but maybe you can contrast and compare.
It's part of the West Bank, but anyways, yeah.
Yes, actually, I mean, there is a Judaization of areas in Hebron. Israel is Judaizing certain neighborhoods in Hebron. And as mentioned, of course, there is the Galilee and the Negev. And I think this is an important question, and it's going to help me to not only to answer it, but also to make more general conclusions out of my answer to this question. Israel conducts similarly, actually, in not only in the occupied Palestinian territory that was occupied in 1967, but also in the areas in which it claimed its sovereignty since 1948. It uses similar, although in some cases using different tools, but similar policies. So if you look at the Bedouins who live in the West Bank in Area C, and you look at the Bedouins in Al-Naqab, Negev, you will find that the types of policies, the home demolition and the arguments that are used for home demolitions and the penalties for Palestinians who try to stay in their lands and to cultivate their lands are very similar, despite the fact that totally different systems are applicable, different legal systems are applicable in both places. One place is under Israeli legal system and the other place is under the Israeli army legal system, the Israeli army, the military system. But these both systems are under the same regime. And we can see how similar the policies are at the end of the day. A village is being demolished here and the village is being demolished there, and so forth. And if you look at Jerusalem and compare it to what happened in different places in historic Palestine since 1948, you will find that it is very similar. And that's important because currently, and maybe that leads also to a small intervention that I can make in the other question. More and more recognition is currently being presented by different human rights organizations leading this, Palestinian, Israeli, international, that from the Mediterranean River to from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, there is a single apartheid regime that is dominating all of the Palestinian population, not only those who are present in Israel, Palestine, but also the refugees who were forcibly displaced in different stages throughout the conflict, dominating this population and creating, establishing domination of a superior population, namely the Jewish population, over the Palestinian population. And this is happening through colonization, through displacement, through policing, through torture, through different things that are happening on both sides of the line. And I think this is an important fact to recognize at the moment. And I would say if I was in Canada and I was a Canadian and I wanted to advocate for justice in Palestine, I would look for methods to mainstream this concept. Of course, it's very well explained in a number of reports that have come out. Human Rights Watch, Beit Salem, Yeshdin, Al-Haq, of course, and other Palestinian organizations before. And now we are expecting an important report from Amnesty International and the Special Rapporteur on the Occupied Palestinian Territory will also potentially issue a report in March. Professor Michael Link, who is actually Canadian himself, will issue a report in March examining the question of apartheid. The importance of this apartheid regime is not that it provides for any specific political end to this conflict. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will end up in one state or two states or three or whatever other specific solutions. But the significance of this framework is that it clarifies that our problem is not that there is just a state that conducts violations of human rights like any other place. Every state in the world, including Canada, actually, violates human rights on a continuous basis here and there. But this regime is doing that systematically and targeting a specific racial and religious group, basically the Palestinians, not religious, but racial group, as I'm using the language of the apartheid definition, and therefore it's very important to recognize this framework, because the answer to this is to change this regime. Even if Israel withdraws from the West Bank and Gaza, the problem, including East Jerusalem, the problem is not over yet. The problem is that Israel recently, in 2018, issued a basic law, a constitutional law, that says that Israel is, a Jewish national state, and one of the articles says that only Jews they have the right to self-determination in Israel. In no other place in the world can a state actually make such a statement so bluntly, and this is because we have been seeing that there are states in the world that encouraged this, that this is a Jewish state, recognize it as a Jewish state. What? We don't recognize states as this and that. States should treat everybody equally and should function according to human rights. So I believe that it will help us to understand and recognize this this framework, and that will actually help us to target the whole regime fundamentally, which will probably end up helping with dismantling the wrong aspects of this regime at the end. Thank you.
That was a very good and broad conclusion. Maybe I can ask Lily if she has some final words she'd like to leave with us, thoughts she'd like to leave with us before we, I'm going to ask Paula to thank our two speakers in a second, but maybe Lily would like to just say some final things.
Well, I just want to say that when I think of South Africa and what was done at the end of the day, when the whole world was against apartheid, and the South African government then had to renegotiate with the late Nelson Mandela in his cell and end the apartheid regime. I'm hoping that one day, well, we've been in this apartheid regime almost for 15 years or more now, but still the world does not recognize that Israel is a apartheid regime. Plus what I've said before, a few minutes ago, that it's very important to implement resolutions 242 and 338, where it is important for us, to reach our self-determination and also to live free of occupation. This is the last occupation in this globe, and I don't know why Israel is being treated above the law. Well, I understand, but I don't know why all these democratic, so-called democratic countries are supporting it and are actually intimidated by it because of the security of Israel. That is very important. And also the intimidation is because of the Holocaust, which has become an industry for the Israelis, and they're capitalizing on it. So I hope one day that, the whole world will stand by us, help us, and at least we're like all other people. We're very peaceful people, and we're non-violent too.
Thank you, Lily.
I'm
going to, in a second, I'm going to ask Paula to thank both of you. Before we do that, I want to thank Yasmin, our secretary, who's been in the background helping us with the technical parts of it. I do want to make an announcement about our next webinar, which will be on February the 16th. And we're going to be looking at the question of Hamas. What kind of support does it have? What kind of challenges it got? In Canada, Hamas is looked on as like a boogeyman, sort of a terrible terrorist, kind of a Palestinian ISIS or whatever. And I think we would do well to have a better understanding of both its strengths and its weaknesses. And we've asked 3 different Palestinians from different areas of Palestine to give us their, none of them is a member of Hamas, but give a perspective on that organization. So I want to thank everybody for attending, but I want to turn over to Paula to give a final thanks to our two speakers. Paula?
Yes, well, definitely thank you for joining us and enlightening us. As much as we read and get videos and think we know, there's always something new to learn. And so you've shared a lot of new information, not just about like what's happening in Jerusalem, but specifically with the universities and the constant obstacles and challenges. So all the power to you guys for pushing through that and going on day by day. Palestinians truly are the most resilient. And to ending the occupation, we say inshallah, and we will continue to pressure our government. Know that there are a lot of groups here that are comprised of not just Palestinians. We have a lot of like non-Arab groups. We even have one specifically that are Jewish groups that are saying like, not in my name, and they are fighting hard. Social media is helping, like you said, to get the word out. Otherwise, they would be doing a lot worse than, you know, they're doing this with the world watching. Imagine if the world wasn't watching. So we will continue. Anything else that, you know, you recommend that Canada do or not do, stop doing, you know, we'll follow you on social media and keep up to date with what's going on. So thank you guys once again for enlightening us today.
Thank you,
Thank
Paula.
you.
Thank you, Munir. Thank you, Lily. And thank you for all those who are attending the webinar today. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Go in
You
peace.
too, Sam.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.